we hear quite a lot is that, especially if you're a guy, you can't talk about abortions because you're not a woman. So the basic idea behind this seems to be that since you are a guy, you're never going to get an abortion. It's impossible, which means you shouldn't be able to talk about it, and your opinion doesn't really matter. When compared to a woman, your opinion is, well, it's pretty insignificant. So first off, most, I guess, logical people realize that's a bad argument. You can't argue based on you're not a woman, so your opinion doesn't matter. It's just poor argument. But every time I hear that, I think of slavery, for instance, because you had the northern states and the southern states, and they were often at odds with regards to slavery. Obviously, the northern states wanted to stop expanding slavery, and eventually they were the reason that the slaves were emancipated. But the southern states obviously used this similar argument, saying they're not your slaves, they're our slaves, they're what they saw as property, so you can't tell us what to do with our property. And now, I'm not saying that slavery and abortion are the same thing, but I'm saying there's similar logic there. Also, there are plenty of instances where laws are enacted by females, by governors who are females, banning or restricting abortions, and the pro-choice side is still not happy about it. So even if it is a woman, if that woman disagrees with you, you're still going to push back against it. So pushing back against someone who's a man using that argument, it's just poor. It makes no sense. So another argument we hear, and I heard this quite recently actually, is that if you're pro-life, you're not really pro-life, you're just pro-birth. That you want the baby to be born, but then you don't care about it at all, that it can just suffer and die, and you don't care. Now, even if that were true, I would argue that most people would rather grow up and have a difficult life than have no life at all, right? So even if it's true that every fetus who is not aborted would have a very difficult life and live in poverty and just have a horrible family situation, they are still alive, and that is a big plus. But it's also not true that pro-life people just don't care about life. So here is some data that talks about charitable giving on the conservative side and the liberal side. And what you can see here in this first image here on the left is that conservative households tend to earn a little bit less than their liberal counterparts, about 6% less. However, those households still give about 30% more to charity than liberal households do. Similarly, if you look at the top 15 states for charitable giving, all 15 of them went Republican in 2012. And if you look at the bottom 15 states, 13 of them went Democrat in 2012. So this data is pretty obvious or pretty evident that conservatives tend to give more to charity than liberals do. And this kind of helps the belief that most conservatives don't want to pay for things like increased welfare or increased just what they consider government handouts, because that is a tax on them, and a lot of them don't see it as being efficient, right? So one argument against the charitable giving data that I've given here is that Republicans or conservatives tend to be more religious, and so a lot of the charitable givings go to religious institutions, which I don't think negates the fact that they give more money than their Democrat counterparts, because the purpose of many of those institutions is to help those who are impoverished. So if you want to argue if government is more effective than charitable institutions, then that's an argument we can have. But Republicans tend to believe that those institutions are more effective than government, and for that reason, they generally opposed increased taxes to pay for things like welfare. The next two topics that I'm going to address, the sources, all come from the Guttmacher Institute, which is a pro-choice institute. It's left-leaning. So I invite you to go look at the sources for everything that I provided here. They're going to be down in the description below. But this first one is that you sometimes hear the argument that abortions cannot be banned because they are medically necessary. Now, disregard the fact that the vast majority of abortion restrictions would still allow abortions in the case of real medical necessities. But let's take that argument and say that abortions are medically necessary and they shouldn't be banned. So this data actually comes from 2004, where they asked women who had gotten abortions their number one reason, or their most important reason for having the abortion. Out of all the women they asked, only 7% said that it had either something to do with their own physical health or possible physical problems of the fetus. So that means that 93% of the women who got abortions that were surveyed did so basically as an elective abortion. So it wasn't medically necessary. They chose to do it for various other reasons. The most important reason is you see here is 25% said that they weren't ready for another child or a child in general, or the timing was wrong, and then 23% said that they just can't afford it. So the top two reasons had nothing to do with health, it just had to do with convenience. Now, to be fair, in that same source, there is another table that looks like this, where you can see that now the women gave all of the reasons that they came in for an abortion, so not just their number one reason, but every reason that was important to them. And you see here the number now changes to 25%. I feel like this data isn't as accurate or as useful because obviously the numbers here do not add up to 100, because if you can choose more than one option, you're not going to get 100 when you add up all the options. But even if we take this and we split the difference with our previous answer, we get 16%. So I think at most, and this is again at most, 16% of abortions might be medically necessary. So that goes to show you that 84% are certainly not, and that at least 84% are elective abortions. They're not medically necessary. The last topic that I want to talk about today is that no one uses abortion as a form of birth control. Now, I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'll go through this fairly quick. I don't want this video to be too long, but the basic idea is that just what I said. You have those on the left who say that abortion is never used as a form of birth control, and so there's nothing wrong with that. Now, the reason they say that is because most of us inherently believe that there is something immoral about abortion if it were used as a form of birth control. Because if the options are either I use one form of birth control or I just get an abortion later, most people would see that the abortion is the worse or the less moral of those two choices. But a survey and a study that they did, again, the Guttmacher Institute, found that it's actually a higher percentage of people who do treat it as birth control than you would expect. So the title says, about half of U.S. abortion patients report using contraception in the month they became pregnant. So what they did is they interviewed or they questioned women who'd gotten abortions in 2014 and asked them about their contraceptive use in the month that they became pregnant. Unfortunately, the actual questions they used to determine if someone was a user or a non-user of birth control, it's not explicitly stated in the study, but it says something along the lines of they were considered to be a user if they did not intentionally stop using a form of birth control. So 51% of women fall into that category. Let that sink in for just a little bit. Only 51%. That means 49% of women fall into some other category. Those 49% of women are those who, at least at some point, purposefully chose to not use any form of birth control. And again, it's not very clear, so it could be a one-time thing, or it could be a repetitive thing, that they didn't use birth control for, I don't want to get into too much detail about this because I don't want to be put in restrictive mode, but it could be that they just didn't use it at all, right? So we don't really know, but we know at least that they chose to not use it at least several times in that month. So this shows you that almost 49% could be using it as a form of birth control. And to me, that number is, honestly, it's quite staggering. That shouldn't, even if abortion is legal, that should be much, much lower. And you can see here that actually it has gone up since 2000 study that they did. It went from, as I said, it went from 46% to 49% in that category. So this is pretty much where I want to leave it because the video, as I said, is getting a bit too long for me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it. Go ahead and check out my sources. If you feel like I misquoted something or misrepresented a source, you can let me know that too. And yeah, I hope to be able to keep doing these videos. I'm just starting, so we'll see how it goes. I'm not super experienced with editing, but if people enjoy it, I'll keep making them.